For decades. I mean, the whole architecture of global power was just reassuringly heavy, you know?
Oh, absolutely. Very physical.
Right, you could measure a nation's threat level just by literally counting the physical tonnage of its aircraft carriers, or the concrete footprint of uranium enrichment facilities.
Right, or just the geographic spread of their infantry.
Exactly. Power was completely bound by the laws of physics. If a state wanted to cripple an adversary, they had to move these massive, highly visible amounts of metal and explosive material across oceans.
Which, that created a system of deterrence that was entirely based on observation.
Because you could see it coming.
Right. Satellites could track troop movements. Inspectors could fly in and verify warhead counts. The sheer logistical friction of kinetic war gave diplomats time to actually negotiate.
Yeah.
We lived in a world where the destructive capacity of a state was tethered to its physical infrastructure. But, that physical tether has just entirely snapped.
It really has. We are now navigating this geopolitical landscape where the most devastating weapons are weightless. They're infinitely replicable, and they operate on timelines measured in, like, milliseconds.
Milliseconds, yeah. It's terrifying.
Right. We're no longer talking about localized destruction. We are looking at autonomous systems capable of mapping and, well, exploiting the foundational logic of the global digital infrastructure. It's fundamentally rewriting the rules of surveillance, sovereignty, and state violence.
And this transition isn't just theoretical anymore, It's the defining reality of early 2026.
Very much so.
That friction that used to slow down global conflict, the time it took to find a vulnerability, analyze it, figure out a response that has just been collapsed by frontier artificial intelligence.
Yeah, we're basically forced to confront a paradigm where extreme capability is scaling way faster than our political or ethical frameworks can adapt.
Faster than we can even comprehend, honestly.
So that collision between unlimited digital capability and deeply flawed human governance is the core of our analysis today on this deep dive.
It's a heavy topic.
It is. And we are grounding this deep dive in a really highly provocative piece of source material from April 9th, 2026. It's a blog post titled Barackface, AI's Reckoning, Power Principles and the Cyber Path to Peace in an Age of Unprecedented Capability.
Quite a title.
Yeah, and the author is Paramendra Kumar Bhagat. And his background provides just a fascinating lens for this because he was Barack Obama's first full-time volunteer in New York City.
Right, so he has those deep roots in grassroots political organization.
Exactly. But he applies that highly organizational mindset to cutting-edge tech philosophy.
Which creates a very stark synthesis. He isn't just analyzing code in a vacuum.
No, not at all.
He's evaluating Silicon Valley's output through the lens of a geopolitical operative. He looks at AI not as a consumer product, but as this lever of raw power that essentially demands to be used.
Right, and we have to pause here because it is a profoundly polarized perspective. And for you listening, it's really crucial to understand the framing of our deep dive today. Bhagat holds highly uncompromising, deeply specific views regarding U.S. border administration, domestic security policy, and particularly the conflict in the Middle East.
Yeah, his language is unapologetic.
It's starkly definitive.
Yeah.
So as we map out his thesis today, we're just analyzing the structural logic of his arguments, to understand the technological realities he's highlighting.
We are strictly decoding the architecture of his geopolitical strategy.
Right. We are in no way adopting or endorsing those underlying political or geopolitical positions. We're strictly neutral here.
Yeah.
The value of this text is in how it forces us to confront the immediate real-world application of these extreme AI capabilities.
Absolutely. And the urgency in his writing is entirely driven by a very specific technological catalyst.
Right, the inciting incident.
Exactly. He points directly to the recent deployment of Claude Mythos preview. And, we need to be clear. This isn't just an iterative update to some chatbot.
No, this is a massive leap.
Right. According to the text, this frontier model demonstrated the ability to autonomously discover and exploit thousands of high-severity zero-day vulnerabilities.
Across deeply embedded foundational systems.
Yeah, specifically naming things like OpenBSD, FFmpeg, and the Linux kernel.
Right. And to really grasp the gravity of that, for you listening, we need to strip away the standard, Hollywood hacker mythology.
Right, it's not a guy in a hoodie guessing a password.
Exactly. A zero-day isn't a misplaced password. It represents a fundamental flaw in the logical architecture of the software itself, a flaw that the original developers are completely blind to.
And historically, finding just one of these required elite human researchers to perform, excruciatingly complex memory layout analysis.
Or reverse engineering over months.
Months, sometimes years. It requires a human mind to hold the entire architecture of a system in their head to find the one microscopic contradiction in its logic.
Yeah, and state intelligence agencies treat these discoveries like sovereign wealth.
They hoard them, absolutely.
They lock them in vaults. So what Mythos represents is the total automation of that discovery process. By ingesting and analyzing millions of lines of code simultaneously, an AI doesn't just look for known patterns of failure.
Right, it simulates execution paths at a scale that's just physically impossible for human cognition. It maps the entire topology of the software to find those structural weaknesses.
And finding the weakness in something like the Linux kernel, that isn't a localized problem. The Linux kernel is basically the underlying nervous system of the modern world.
Yeah, it runs everything.
It runs the global cloud infrastructure, the financial sectors, high-frequency trading servers, mobile telecommunications networks. Finding thousands of invisible structural flaws in that foundation, it's akin to discovering an autoimmune disease in the internet itself.
The biological analogy is spot on there. Because it's an autoimmune vulnerability, the system's own foundational rules are being leveraged to compromise it.
Oh, yeah.
But the text highlights an even more alarming capability. Mythos doesn't just passively flag these vulnerabilities and say, hey, look what I found.
It acts on them.
It exhibits the autonomy to actively chain them together. It can escape sandboxing protections and compile working exploits with minimal human direction.
And that chaining mechanism, that is the true paradigm shift. Getting a foothold in a system is utterly useless if you're trapped inside an isolated environment.
Right, the sandbox.
Yeah. The AI has to discover a flaw just to enter the perimeter, then dynamically discover a secondary flaw in the privilege escalation protocols to gain administrative control.
And then exploit a third flaw to break out into the host operating system.
Exactly. Automating that entire sequence, dynamically adjusting the attack vector in real time as the system pushes back that removes the final bottleneck in cyber warfare.
Because the bottleneck has always been human ingenuity, right?
Yeah.
And reaction time.
Yeah.
If you completely automate the exploit generation cycle, you alter the fundamental economics of cybersecurity. Well, defense is inherently reactive. You patch the holes you know about. But if an autonomous agent can generate novel attack chains continuously, defense mathematically collapses. The perimeter just becomes completely porous.
So it's basically like possessing a machine that suddenly prints the master keys to every locked door, bank vault, and military base on Earth.
That's exactly what it is.
So the question for you listening is, if we suddenly possess the master keys to the digital world, is the natural human instinct to lock the doors for safety or to immediately go rob our enemies?
Wow. Yeah. And that naturally fragments how people view this capability.
Right.
The text cites a reaction from Vince Golubic, who looks at this automated exploit generator and immediately envisions this bizarrely cynical, hyper-capitalist future.
Right, the bug bounty thing.
Yeah, he speculates about a pay-per-exploit bounty revenue model, where AI models might even begin seeding latent vulnerabilities into code bases specifically to harvest the bounties for discovering them later.
Wait, really? Like hiding Easter eggs just to get paid to find them later?
Exactly. Golubic is highlighting the perverse incentives of the bug bounty ecosystem. If a machine can infinitely generate supply in a market that pays for the discovery of structural flaws, it essentially turns global digital security into an automated hustle.
Just a revenue generator.
Right. It treats this civilization-altering capability as just another mechanism for arbitrary value extraction.
But Bogot's reaction is violently different. He looks at this exact same capability, the ability to systematically dismantle any digital infrastructure, and his response aligns entirely with the novel he had previously written.
Yeah, he's very direct about it.
He states, and I quote, "Let's use it to demolish the Islamic Republic. That is my anti-war stand," end quote. He skips right past the economic implications and immediately drafts the technology for regime change.
Because he is asking a deeply uncomfortable question about the nature of power. If you possess a tool capable of silently disabling the command and control infrastructure of an adversary, neutralizing their air defenses, wiping their central banking ledgers, and you can do all that without deploying a single soldier, the geopolitical pressure to utilize that tool becomes nearly absolute.
You'd have to use it.
Right. He frames the deployment of this autonomous cyber capability not as an act of aggression, but as the ultimate alternative to kinetic slaughter.
Which immediately forces a historic confrontation over sovereignty and control. Because, okay, if an AI model is now the equivalent of a strategic deterrent, who actually gets to hold the keys?
Who controls the deterrent? Exactly.
Right. We are looking at the unprecedented friction that erupted in early 2026 between Anthropic, the private AI lab that developed this capability, and the Department of Defense.
Yeah, the text details Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei flatly refusing contract terms that would grant the Pentagon unrestricted deployment of their frontier model.
Which is huge.
It is, and to contextualize this, we have to look at Anthropic's foundational architecture. They built their entire organizational identity on the concept of constitutional AI.
And constitutional AI isn't just like a vague ethical mission statement on a corporate website. It's a very specific training methodology.
Right.
Instead of relying purely on massive pools of human feedback to train the model on what is helpful or harmful, which is slow and inherently biased, they use an AI to supervise the training based on an explicit, hard-coded set of constitutional principles.
The model recursively refines its own outputs to align with that constitution.
Precisely. The safety mechanisms aren't just layered on top at the end. They are baked into the reinforcement learning cycle.
So when Amodei draws his red lines with the military, he isn't just making a PR calculation. He is protecting the structural integrity of his product.
And the text highlights two uncompromising red lines that he drew. The first is a total prohibition on using the technology for mass domestic surveillance.
Amodei argues that unleashing frontier models on domestic data poses serious, novel risks to our fundamental liberties.
And the word novel is critical there, because traditional surveillance is constrained by human resources. To build a comprehensive profile on a citizen, human analysts had to actively connect disparate records.
Right. Financial transactions, property deeds, geolocation pings.
Toll booth logs. The friction of that labor naturally limited the scope of the surveillance state. They couldn't watch everyone.
But frontier AI entirely eliminates that friction. It utilizes advanced ontology mapping and entity resolution at scale.
Which means what, exactly, for the listener?
It means it doesn't just passively store the data. It actively maps the semantic relationships between millions of disparate data points in real time. It can instantly synthesize a perfectly cohesive predictive profile of an individual's behavior, their associations, their vulnerabilities, all from scattered, completely public information. It transforms ambient data exhaust into targeted intelligence. Amodei recognizes that providing that capability to a domestic security apparatus irrevocably alters the relationship between the state and the citizen.
It's terrifying. And his second red line addresses the kinetic application. He completely rejects the removal of human oversight in lethal decision loops, so autonomous weapons.
Right, and his reasoning here is highly technical, not just philosophical.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Despite the massive capabilities of something like Mythos, LLMs still suffer from latent hallucination loops and non-deterministic logic leaks.
That make things up.
Exactly. In a lethal targeting scenario, the latency of a kill chain requires absolute precision. If the model misinterprets a complex visual field or hallucinates a threat parameter, the resulting escalation is catastrophic.
There's no undo button.
Right. Amodei argues that the foundational architecture of these models is simply not robust enough yet to meet the zero-tolerance error rates that professional warfighters demand.
And the administration's reaction to being denied this capability by a private CEO was overwhelming. I mean, the text describes it as intensely coercive. It notes threats of contract termination, but more significantly, the administration slapped Anthropic with a supply chain risk designation.
Which is brutal.
That isn't just bureaucratic maneuvering. That is a blunt force economic weapon. Right?
It is. A supply chain risk designation effectively treats a domestic corporation as a hostile entity. It legally prohibits any federal agency from procuring their services, but the contagion effect is much wider.
Because everyone else gets scared off.
Exactly. Allied governments, cautious enterprise clients, critical cloud infrastructure providers, they all immediately freeze them out. It starves the company of the capital and compute necessary to maintain their position at the frontier.
And furthermore, the text mentions the administration threatening to invoke the Defense Production Act.
Which is a wartime statute.
Right. So how did we reach a point where a private CEO in Silicon Valley is effectively dictating the moral boundaries of national security to the U.S. military? Are tech companies becoming sovereign entities?
It certainly implies that the government views frontier AI not as a commercial product, but as critical national security infrastructure that they have an inherent right to control.
Yeah.
Anthropic's pushback in court, maintaining that they share a mandate for foreign defense but cannot compromise their constitutional parameters for domestic or lethal applications, it really highlights a structural crisis in modern governance.
Unelected tech executives are essentially establishing the moral and operational boundaries of state power simply because they hold the monopoly on the underlying mathematics.
It creates a very fragile equilibrium. The state demands unlimited capability to ensure security, while the architects of that capability act as unilateral constraint mechanisms.
Right.
And to illustrate exactly why Amodei is so terrified of allowing that capability to seep into domestic governance, Bagat transitions the analysis to Palantir.
Which is fascinating.
It is, because Palantir is a company that has built its entire operational model on navigating the tension between data integration and state power.
Right. Pagat constructs a very effective historical dichotomy here. He begins with the ultimate argument for capability. He poses a hypothetical scenario in 1998, suggesting that if Palantir's data fusion architecture had existed back then, the 9/11 attacks could have been structurally prevented.
Because the intelligence failure prior to 9/11 wasn't a lack of raw data, it was a failure of ontology.
They couldn't connect the dots.
Exactly. The CIA, the FBI, the NSA, they all possessed fragmented intelligence, flight school enrollments, anomalous international wire transfers, specific travel chronologies. But those databases were siloed. They lacked a connective framework.
And Palantir's architecture is designed precisely to resolve that. By creating a centralized graph database where every data point is a node, the software automatically surfaces the hidden relationships.
It would have synthesized those isolated fragments into a blindingly obvious threat matrix.
So if a technology mathematically guarantees the prevention of mass casualties, the moral imperative to deploy it seems absolute, right?
You'd think so.
But Fagat immediately juxtaposes that theoretical necessity from 1998 against the practical reality of how that exact same architecture is deployed domestically in 2026. The text focuses heavily on Palantir's current integration with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, specifically detailing a suite called Immigration OS.
Right, the Immigration Lifecycle Operating System. And this is the exact manifestation of Amodei's fears regarding frictionless surveillance.
Yeah.
Immigration OS utilizes that same graph database architecture, the one designed to track decentralized terror networks, and applies it to civil immigration infractions.
Related visa overstays.
Exactly. The text notes it provides near real-time visibility on visa overstays, self-deportations, and targets individuals for enforcement by fusing massive repositories of both public and private sector data.
So we're talking about integrating DMV records, credit agency histories, utility bills, social media sentiment analysis, and license plate reader networks all into a single, cohesive interface.
The state no longer has to actively investigate an infraction. The system just passively flags the anomaly and generates the enforcement protocol automatically.
And this generates immense societal friction because it completely divorces efficiency from justice. Pagat uses a very grounded analogy to illustrate the inherent danger of this. He suggests that if this exact level of automated data synthesis and real-time tracking were applied to minor domestic infractions like handing out speeding tickets based on a fusion of GPS telemetry, toll transponders, and automated bank withdrawals, the resulting society would be utterly intolerable.
It would trigger a widespread societal revolt.
It's like building an all-seeing eye to spot a dragon, but once the dragon is gone, the eye starts glaring at people for jaywalking.
That's a great way to put it, because living under a system of perfect, unyielding enforcement removes the essential buffer of human discretion. A perfectly efficient state is basically indistinguishable from a digital panopticon. The system is built to identify extreme threats, but the architecture requires a constant intake of data to justify its own immense operational cost.
So it has to find something to do.
Right. Once the extreme threat is mitigated, the system's parameters inevitably widen to target increasingly minor infractions. The infrastructure of counterterrorism slowly degrades into the infrastructure of daily compliance.
The author says, just because you can doesn't mean you should. But history shows that if a state can use a tool, it eventually does. Is the author asking for a level of governmental restraint that has literally never existed?
I mean, it highlights the historical fallacy of relying on state restraint. The architecture of surveillance is permanent, while the political intent behind it is fluid.
Right.
Tools constructed to monitor foreign adversaries during a crisis inevitably become permanent fixtures of the domestic administrative state. The capability dictates the policy.
And that structural inevitability makes the prospect of domestic AI integration feel incredibly bleak. But Fagot introduces a highly compelling, almost optimistic countermechanism. If the government can use AI to watch the people, what happens when the people use AI to watch the government?
Right. He frames this as reverse surveillance. It is the concept of symmetrical capability.
Symmetrical capability, I like that.
Yeah, the power of data fusion no longer resides exclusively within secure government facilities. Citizens armed with advanced tools like Claude now possess the analytical bandwidth to scrutinize the state at a microscopic level.
The text details the practical applications of this. It's about voters tracking official actions, fact-checking political claims in real time, holding power accountable to pierce through noise and propaganda. Fagot uses the phrase, democratizing complexity.
And that phrase is so key because it isolates the primary defense mechanism of modern political power.
Which is?
Power protects its interests not through secrecy, but through impenetrable density.
Oh, that's so true.
Right. Regulatory capture, corporate subsidies, structural corruption, they are rarely hidden. They are simply buried within 2,000-page omnibus spending bills or convoluted task codes or highly technical zoning ordinances.
Because the average citizen, just constrained by time and cognitive load, cannot effectively parse that density. Complexity acts as camouflage.
But an autonomous AI agent entirely neutralizes that camouflage. An LLM can ingest a 2,000-page legislative document, cross-reference the proposed regulatory shifts against decades of historical market data, and instantly map the secondary economic effects to the specific investment portfolios of the politicians sponsoring the bill.
And then just synthesize all that labyrinthine data into a single comprehensive paragraph of plain English.
Exactly.
So imagine you, the listener, sitting in a town hall meeting. A politician quotes a statistic, and within 2 seconds, your AI agent cross-references 30 years of tax records, state budgets, and voting history to whisper the actual truth in your ear. It fundamentally shifts the balance of power.
It permanently alters the daily mechanics of political operation. If a politician can no longer rely on complexity to obscure their intent, the entire lobbying apparatus has to evolve.
Yeah, they can't hide anymore.
They can no longer slip a massive subsidy into the final hours of a legislative session because millions of personalized AI agents will instantly flag the anomaly, identify the beneficiaries, and alert their respective users before the ink is even dry.
It forces a level of hyper-transparency that the current political ecosystem is structurally incapable of handling.
It's a beautiful democratic ideal, but Fagot clearly values that ideal while simultaneously refusing to let the analysis linger in the safety of civic debate.
Right, he pivots hard here.
He abruptly pulls the narrative away from domestic policy and plunges us directly into the kinetic brutality of the global stage. He grounds the ultimate test of AI capability not in a town hall, but in the massive geopolitical rupture that the tech states occurred in early 2026.
And this transition is jarring by design. We started by talking about software code and AI models in Silicon Valley. Now we are talking about missile strikes, the Strait of Hormuz, and the death of a supreme leader.
He moves from the theoretical friction of code to the catastrophic reality of high-intensity warfare.
Right. And again, just a gentle reminder for you listening, we are analyzing the author's intense framing of this conflict to understand his technological thesis. These are his characterizations. The text documents the outbreak of a major regional war on February 28, 2026, initiated by U.S. and Israeli kinetic strikes under the operational designation Operation Epic Fury.
And the text is highly specific about the parameters of these strikes. They targeted military installations, critical infrastructure grids, and top-tier leadership.
Notably resulting in the death of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. The author refers to him as the late in the text.
To understand Fagot's strategic thesis here, we really have to analyze how he defines the adversary. He wholly rejects standard geopolitical pragmatism.
He does. He uses intensely stark language.
He characterizes the regime as basically the definition of evil and fundamentally incompatible with global stability. He cites systemic internal repression, the theocratic stranglehold, and crucially, its structural reliance on exporting asymmetric violence through proxy networks.
Specifically naming Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. Because he views the regime as an inherently destabilizing force, the resulting chaos of Operation Epic Fury is portrayed as the inevitable cost of confronting that reality.
And the text details massive retaliation and fallout. Iran struck back with missiles, drones, and critical disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz.
which leads to civilian tolls, regional chaos, and massive global economic ripples. The text notes this widespread fallout culminated in a fragile 2-week ceasefire around April 7th or 8th.
And Fagat uses this specific fallout to attack the prevailing diplomatic consensus. He aggressively rejects the idea that this is just a peripheral, proxy-only war.
Right, he calls that the stupidest take.
Exactly. He defines the conflict instead as a civilizational fault line that demands clarity, not equivocation. So how does the author bridge this massive gap between digital capability and kinetic warfare? How do we go from mythos to epic fury?
That is the synthesis of the entire piece. The connection, Hagat argues, is that the horrors of this traditional bloody war could have been entirely circumvented by wielding the very technology we discussed at the start.
The text brings us back to Anthropic, specifically detailing a defensive cybersecurity initiative called Project Glasswing.
Right. Project Glasswing represents the operationalization of the mythos capability. Pagat's core thesis, which actually mirrors the plot of his novel, is that instead of dropping physical bombs and inflicting the collateral horror of kinetic war, AI should be used as a precision anti-war lever.
A cyber path to peace.
Exactly. He is proposing a total redefinition of warfare. Instead of relying on physical munitions that devastate civilian populations and shatter physical infrastructure, he advocates wielding an AI-like mythos to digitally dismantle the adversary's coercive apparatus from the inside out. The mechanics of this are just, well, terrifyingly elegant. It involves utilizing the automated exploit generation of mythos to cripple command systems, infiltrate the regime's central banking ledgers, and starve their financial networks so they are unable to fund their proxy militias.
It means mapping the vulnerabilities in their domestic internet controls and shutting down their propaganda machinery, severing their ability to coordinate internal repression.
Right. He uses the phrase, demolish its coercive apparatus digitally. It is the application of infinite automated 0 days to silently brick the machinery of state control.
And he describes this strategy as surgical and asymmetric. He makes a vital philosophical distinction here. Deploying this level of cyber capability is not pacifism born of weakness. It is the projection of absolute strength through intelligence.
Furthermore, he connects this aggressive foreign deployment perfectly back to Dario Amadei's red lines from the beginning of the text.
Oh, that's true. It fits perfectly.
Right. By using AI to surgically dismantle a foreign threat, you fulfill the duty to defend democracy against existential threats abroad, without crossing the line into kinetic lethality and without undermining liberties through mass surveillance at home.
It offers a mathematically clean solution to an immensely messy geopolitical reality. AI forces humanity to make an active choice here. We cannot wait for perfect policy. We must prioritize genuine foreign threats with targeted digital defense, entirely rejecting domestic overreach and unchecked lethality.
But I have a huge ethical question about this, based on the text. The author frames crippling a nation's financial network and infrastructure via cyber attack as an anti-war alternative to bombing.
Right.
But if a nation's financial grid collapses, don't the everyday citizens still suffer immensely? I mean, hospitals lose power, supply chains fail, civilian savings are erased. Is cyber warfare truly a path to peace, or just a different, quieter kind of devastation?
That blind spot is the central paradox of cyber warfare. Because the weapon is invisible, we assume the damage is abstract. But disabling a modern society's digital nervous system guarantees a massive civilian toll. It simply shifts the mechanism of death from shrapnel to systemic friction. The cascading effects are inherently unpredictable.
And that friction is where we will wrap up our summary today. For those of you listening, you've explored the razor's edge of 2026 with us. From the terrifying 0-day capabilities of Claude Mythos to Anthropic standoff with the Pentagon.
We looked at Palantir's immigration tools, the democratizing hope of reverse surveillance.
And finally, Pagat's proposal to replace the kinetic horrors of the Iran war with surgical AI-driven cyber operations. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final lingering question to ponder that extends beyond the source material.
It's a critical question.
The author builds this entire cyber path to peace on the assumption that we hold the godlike AI tool to surgically dismantle our adversaries. But technology inherently proliferates.
It always spreads.
Always. What happens to global security the very next day when the adversary develops their own version of mythos? If world peace currently relies on our asymmetric AI advantage, what happens the moment the digital playing field levels out?
That's the real threat.
Something to mull over.
Ah.
Thank you for taking this incredibly complex deep dive alongside us today. Stay curious, and we'll catch you next time.